Is it time to panic about Jacksonville Jaguars quarterback Trevor Lawrence? All that and more in this episode of the Locked On Dynasty Football Podcast.
You are Locked On Dynasty Football, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Here are your hosts, Marcus Mosher and Kate Madjuk.
Welcome back to the Locked On Dynasty Football Podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. We'd like to thank you for making us your first listen of the day. This episode is brought to you by Gametime. Download the Gametime app, create an account, and use promo code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off your first purchase. Last minute tickets, lowest price guaranteed. I am your host, Marcus Mosher. You can follow me on Twitter at Marcus_Mosher. Joining me today, as always, is Kate Madjuk. You can follow her on Twitter at Kate Madjuk. You can also check out her fantastic work at Pro Football Focus. Kate, we need to have a little heart-to-heart about the Jacksonville Jaguars right now because it's not great. Let's start with Trevor Lawrence. 17 of 29 for 185 yards, 0 touchdowns, 2 interceptions, took 5 sacks, only gave you 7 rushing yards on the ground. Kate, through 9 games, he has 9 passing touchdowns, and it feels like we've been waiting for Trevor Lawrence to break through and be this elite fantasy quarterback. But we're almost through year 3, and it hasn't happened yet.
It hasn't happened yet, but to be fair, like we saw a little bit of that fantasy promise like last season, right? We saw some more of the ups. To this point in the season, like you haven't seen that high upside. And I think what makes it all the more disappointing is just the knowledge that he's got some of the best weapons in the entire NFL. I mean, you're talking, like one of the most talented.
We'll get to one of those weapons.
We'll get to the weapons, but it should be a better pairing than what we've seen, right? Like Trevor Lawrence should be the type of quarterback that can maybe elevate some of those receiving weapons. But like this was just an overall a better and more fluid offense in 2022 than it's been to this point in 2023. Trevor Lawrence averaging just 13.6 fantasy points per game. That is dreadful, Marcus. That is absolutely dreadful. That is, fewer than by a decent chunk, 3 fewer fantasy points per game, fewer than Baker Mayfield, for instance. Yeah. Russell Wilson, he's averaging almost 17 fantasy points per game in comparison. Kyler Murray scored 17 fantasy points in his return from a torn ACL. While throwing 249 passing yards, 0 touchdowns, and an interception, just thanks to what he can do on the ground. Like all things considered, when you surround Trevor Lawrence by Christian Kirk, Evan Ingram, Travis Etienne, Calvin Ridley, like things should be looking up. Like if you told me right now that, Trevor Lawrence would have, a 67% completion rate, like a 223 rushing yards on the year, like I would tell you, okay, we're probably in business. It's just not we're not producing touchdowns, and I don't know what to make of that. Although I'll say like the panic has been there, right? It's not just week 10. They face the San Francisco 49ers coming out of a bye week with another edge rusher in the mix in Chase Young.
What was so discouraging for me is that you saw a couple weeks ago Kirk Cousins light up the 49ers. You saw Joe Burrow with a much worse offensive line light up the 49ers. You're at home and they did nothing. I mean, they weren't even really competitive in this game at all. This is where you're hoping that your quarterback can help elevate the players around you. And it was the opposite. Like Lawrence just did not play well. And now I'm starting to get concerned, and I'm looking at the recent batch of Dynasty League Football ADP. We got some November stuff. At one point, Kate, this offseason, he was being drafted as like QB3, QB4, just behind Jalen Hurts and Patrick Mahomes and Josh Allen. Now he's slipped all the way down to QB8. You have Joe Burrow, Lamar Jackson, Justin Herbert, and Anthony Richardson ahead of him. And I'm even starting to wonder, like, CJ Stroud being drafted as QB10. If it really came push to shove, which one would I rather have in my dynasty leagues? I probably lean Lawrence, but the fact that we're already here after 9-10 games is pretty surprising.
It's very surprising. Like super, super surprising. But I mean, Trevor Lawrence to this point in the season, like I don't know if part of it has to deal with the fact that, the run game, particularly in end zone situations, has been so strong with Travis Etienne. Again, not really the case as much yesterday, but like Trevor Lawrence to this point in the season, 15 total end zone pass attempts, which you want to see more of that. Like Sam Howell, 27, Derek Carr, again, not the best example of efficiency, but 26. Like we're seeing I think a lot more opportunity for other quarterbacks. And maybe, Trevor Lawrence might be a guy that can get more done with those opportunities when he has them, but they haven't presented themselves to this point in this 2022 season. Now, interestingly, if you look at, like his actual data, Marcus, as a passer, as a runner, you should generally be like, relatively encouraged. Like, Lawrence right now on pace for a career high rushing yard total. He's averaging a career high in terms of yards per pass attempt, big time throw rate per PFF. Like, the metrics are generally more encouraging than I think we've seen, translate to the fantasy list, the fantasy production. Are
Some of
we?
them are. So, I mean, you look at like ESPN's QBR, right? And he's 15. And the quarterbacks ahead of him are Baker Mayfield, Josh Dobbs, Gardner Minshew. Like, I was just hoping, listen, I'm a big Trevor Lawrence fan. I was just hoping that this would be the year that he is a resounding top 5 quarterback, and there's no debate about it at all. I think he's closer to being outside of the top 10 than he is to being a top 5 quarterback right now.
Oh yeah, I think that's very fair. I mean, to date this season, among anybody who's attempted a pass right now, Trevor Lawrence ranks 34th in NFL quarterback rating. Like, again, and I think some of that comes from the lack of touchdown production, and part of that comes from the fact that they're not throwing the ball in the end zone as much as you'd like. I don't know, Marcus. Like, I don't know what to do with Trevor Lawrence, because like everything tells you that the upside should be there, but it's just not coming to fruition. So is this one of those things? Like, this can go one of two ways. Either we should be completely and totally panicked that Trevor Lawrence isn't producing with these weapons, or we're about to get like the biggest positive regression boom of all time. And it feels like it's just going to go one of those two ways, and there's no room in between.
As somebody who has Trevor Lawrence in a lot of dynasty leagues, I'm at least considering shopping him starting this week. And up until this date, I really haven't. If I can get somebody, the thing is, if you go to the CJ Stroud manager and ask for CJ Stroud for Trevor Lawrence, I don't think they say yes. I really don't.
I think it's like in the realm of possibility, though, which is just even crazy. But what I guess my biggest question before I sell is diagnosing what's going on. And I haven't been able to do that yet. So do you have a diagnosis for me? As a former nurse, I live and die on the information. Do you have a diagnosis as to why Trevor Lawrence isn't scoring, and why aren't we seeing more touchdown pass? Like, what is wrong with Trevor Lawrence?
I don't. And I wish there was an answer like, hey, his offensive line is just not playing that well. Once they get better, he's going to start throwing more touchdowns. His offensive line is completely healthy. Or maybe it's the receivers. He needs time to gel with these guys, but that's not the case. He's been with Christian Kirk and Evan Ingram for multiple seasons now. I don't know. And I think that's what concerns me is same coaching staff, same offensive line, same receivers, and things just aren't going well. Now, Kate, I do want to talk about one of his weapons who has been very disappointing this season. We will get to him next. This episode is brought to you by Gametime. You shouldn't have to worry when you're buying tickets to your next big event. Gametime is the fastest and the easiest way to buy tickets for all of the sports, music, comedy, and theater near you, with killer deals on all your seats and their best price guarantee. Gametime takes the guesswork out of buying tickets. Gametime is the only ticketing app that gives you complete peace of mind with your purchase. See the view from your seats before you buy so you know exactly what to expect when you arrive. The all-in prices show your total upfront so you know that you're getting a great deal without all those hidden fees. You can also buy your tickets in seconds with just 2 taps. Take the guesswork out of buying tickets with Gametime. Download the Gametime app, create an account, and use promo code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account, redeem promo code LOCKEDONNFL, all one word, for $20 off. Download Gametime today. Last minute tickets, lowest price guaranteed. Welcome back to the Locked On Dynasty Football Podcast. Locked On is kicking up our coverage with Locked On NFL Kickoff Live. Each Friday, Locked On will go live at 2 p.m. Eastern on every Locked On NFL YouTube channel. Hosts Tanisha Batiste, Jarvis Davis, and Kyle Krabs will break down every game on the NFL slate to get you ready for your team's matchup, your fantasy lineups, your betting angles, and so much more. Plus, get the in-depth local analysis from our stable of NFL hosts across the country who know these teams better than anyone else. Find Locked On NFL Kickoff Live every Friday at 2 p.m. Eastern on any Locked On NFL YouTube channel. Okay, let's talk about Calvin Ridley, who we've actually chatted about several times on this show, but basically a no-show against the 49ers, 2 for 20 on 3 targets on the year, 471 yards, 2 touchdowns. I'm starting to get concerned about his long-term value because part of the trade compensation between the Jags and the Falcons was if he signs a second a contract with the Jags, Jacksonville has to give up a second-round pick. I don't know if we've seen enough from Calvin Ridley over the last, 4 or 5 weeks. It suggests that number one, the Jags should give him a long-term deal, and number two, whether they will be willing to part with that second-round pick.
Yeah, I don't know that. I definitely don't think we've really seen that. We've seen almost an identical target share this season between Christian Kirk, Evan Ingram, Calvin Ridley, and just straight up, when you're looking at the dispersal of those targets, the catch percentage, both Christian Kirk and Evan Ingram with a 75+% catch rate. You look at Calvin Ridley, he's just converting less than 60% of those opportunities. And of course, it kind of comes by the nature of Calvin Ridley, right? Leads the team in average depth of target, almost 14 yards average depth of target at this point in the season. So yeah, you're going to convert fewer of those, right? You're kind of begging for inconsistencies at that point, but not producing a ton after the catch. You're just not seeing, I think, enough of those consistencies, right? He's getting a ton of opportunity in the red zone, leading the team by a mile in terms of end zone target share. Just it's not translating to anything that you need it to translate to for fantasy production. But Marcus, you brought up the contract situation, which I think is probably an underrated point when we're talking about Calvin Ridley and his dynasty value, because he is still on his rookie contract, which is the craziest thing. What's the oldest player that's ever played on a rookie contract?
Josh Gordon, I believe.
That actually would make a ton of sense. Calvin Ridley, not to that point yet, but he is getting there. He's going to turn 29 in I think a month. He's going to be 29
December.
years old on his rookie contract. It hits free agency next year. Not necessarily a great situation. So, if
it didn't happen, if Calvin Ridley was going to be a thing, it would have happened early in the season. You would have just seen it click right away. But we're getting to somebody who's, again, you mentioned the age, 29. His contract, is uncertain going into next year. I just wonder if Jacksonville would be you know what, we've got Trevor Lawrence's contract coming up. Let's just keep that second round pick. We'll draft somebody and reset because this just clearly isn't working.
Yeah, when you look at, like I said, some of those inconsistencies, considering that, he has had a similar target share to Evan Ingram, to Calvin Ridley, just 3 games with more than 40 receiving yards so far this season. And again, that kind of feels like what you're asking for. Like you're
Yeah.
gonna get these inconsistencies, but it, to that point, why exercise a second round pick on a guy who hasn't become and emerged as that top receiving option for your club? Like, because it's not just the pick, right? It's also the contract that he's going to have to, he's going to be commanding. And I don't know that a second round pick is what they're probably going to get, especially just considering, Marcus, how talented. And I'm not caught up on this next year's receiving class here yet,
It's
but
excellent. One of the best we've seen.
So why bother?
Right. Well, the other thing is you got to remember they're paying Christian Kirk quite a bit of money. They paid Zay Jones quite a bit of money. Now he's been out. It sounds like he's getting closer to returning.
They're
They
going to
paid
have to
Evan.
pay Trevor Lawrence.
They paid Evan Ingram. Like they're already paying a lot of money for the weapons they have now, and it's not good enough. So why continue to give up more assets and more money for a wide receiver core that's not good enough? And for Calvin Ridley, if he doesn't come back to Jacksonville, I just have a hard time believing on a third team at the age of 29, all of a sudden he's going to become a fantasy superstar. If you have Calvin Ridley in your dynasty leagues, you're probably just riding this out, hoping things get better. But I think that there's no way you can start him with any kind of confidence moving forward.
No, he's definitely flex territory. And again, he's one of these guys that he might win you a week. Maybe. The chances aren't great, but he absolutely has the kind of upside that can win you a week. The issue is that the floor is so incredibly low for Calvin Ridley that it makes the peaks and valleys, like there aren't enough peaks to make these valleys worth it for most fantasy managers, unless you're in a bye week. Unless you're in some dire situations. Now, Marcus, I know you play in a lot of short bench dynasty leagues. What are you doing with Calvin Ridley in those types of situations where like you might not have the luxury to keep him on your roster? What are you going to sell him for?
You can't sell him for one because just nobody's going to really take him on right now. So what I've been trying to do is pair him in a 2-for-1 trade, right? Basically, here's Calvin Ridley and Tony Pollard. What can I get? And it's not been great. I've had a hard time moving him. It's just a really bleak situation right now in Jacksonville. At the quarterback position, at the wide receiver position, it's not great, Kate.
Yeah, I don't want to overact. I'm definitely more panicked right now about Calvin Ridley and his overall dynasty value. I think, for those few teams that I'm still rostering Calvin Ridley, this might be the time to move on, even if you are selling low, because things could get a lot dicier down the road next year when we see what this free agency market looks like for Calvin Ridley. He might disappear into the ether and you've lost all opportunity to move on.
Calvin Ridley, future Carolina Panthers wide receiver.
Why not?
Yeah. Let's talk about a couple of running backs, Kate, that disappointed in week 10. We will get to them next. This episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Score early this NFL season with FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. Right now, new customers can get $150 in bonus bets with any winning $5 moneyline bet. That is $150 if your team wins. If you've been thinking about joining FanDuel, there is no better time to get in on the action. The app is so easy to use. There's a wide range of betting options available, including spreads, player props, over-unders, and so much more. If you want to make a bunch of money, just bet on the Steelers to win every single week. I don't know how they do it, Kate, but they just pull these wins out. It's been very profitable for several of us this year. Visit FanDuel.com/LockedOn and kick off the NFL season with FanDuel, the official partner of the NFL. All right, Kate, let's talk about a couple of running backs who are being drafted as top 10 dynasty running backs right now. Let's start with Breece Hall. Just a really tough game against the Raiders. 13 carries for 28 yards. I did do a little bit in the receiving game, 3 for 47, but I'm going to read you his last 4 games rushing. 13 for 28, 16 for 50, 12 for 17, 12 for 39. This has been rough.
This has been rough. This has definitely been a rough outing, Marcus. And I will say I'm not nearly as panicked maybe as I should be, right? Because the player is still the player. He is still the best player on that entire football. Well, maybe not. Garrett Wilson. Okay, two sides of the same coin. Breece Hall is still Breece Hall, and I think a lot of these struggles are products of lackluster offensive line play. I think that the entire offensive line could be playing better. I think that Breece Hall, without Aaron Rodgers there, without a viable passing game, it can be really hard to establish the run. And I think that's sort of part of what is troubling this team in general. I think it can be hard to disguise your game plan when your game plan is Breece Hall. Now, am I particularly disappointed given the matchup? Like, the Raiders have been a great matchup to run against. They've been allowing a ton of explosive plays to opposing running backs. Like, this should have been a bigger game for Breece Hall. But I think all things considered, when they figure out the quarterback position and they can establish some sort of balance where, you have to cover both the run and the pass, and you have to do so diligently, that is going to open things up for Breece Hall tremendously. We've already seen he's got his burst back. There's no concern on my end that he is not recovering from this torn ACL. Like, all of this feels kind of extraneous at this point to me, and feels very much like a symptom of being the running back of the New York Jets.
He's being drafted, at least by the November batch of ADP, as RB3 behind Bijan Robinson and Christian McCaffrey. The guys behind him, Travis Etienne, Jahmyr Gibbs, Jonathan Taylor, Kenneth Walker, Devin Achane, RB8, by the way.
Devin Achane, RB8 is the craziest thing I've heard all day. But yes, keep going.
Austin Eckler, RB9, Saquon Barkley, RB10. And then it leads us to another running back, Tony Pollard, RB11, has not scored a touchdown since week 1. The Cowboys scored 49 points on Sunday, and he still can't get into the end zone. 15 carries for 55 yards, only averaging 3.9 yards per carry this season. He's another one. I look at the contract. He's a free agent after the year. I wonder, if he's just kind of a sinking asset right now.
It does feel like he's a sinking asset. I mean, across the board, Marcus, like it doesn't matter what metric you're looking at. Explosive run rate, yards after contact per attempt, touches per touchdown scored, missed forced tackle rate. Like, none of them are boding well for Tony Pollard this season. This is just kind of a disaster. And yes, obviously touchdowns, you're disappointed that he's not scoring touchdowns, but it's the inefficiencies, all of the metrics that I just mentioned, that have me the most concerned. Now, I'm still on this train that maybe Tony Pollard is not fully healthy. And when you look at, again, all of these metrics regarding explosion and explosive plays, all of them are down across the board. NFL Next Gen Stats, they track, player speed. Pollard has hit 15 miles an hour on just 16.5% of plays this year, in comparison to almost 26% of plays across his entire career. He's just showing less burst. He's showing a lot of things that, maybe this is him aging a little bit. Maybe this is him coming back from a lower body injury that ended his 2022 season. But regardless, he's a free agent at the end of next year. I don't know how many teams are going to be able to justify giving him a sizable contract to be their workhorse when this is what he's produced when he's become the workhorse.
It's really frustrating. Even Rico Dowdle played more yesterday. He got in the end zone, actually looked quite a bit better than Tony Pollard. My hope is that as we get further on to the season and he's, further removed from that injury, maybe things will get better. Maybe the Cowboys offensive line will start opening up holes. But right now he's kind of a RB2 play where you're just hoping he breaks a long run, which he hasn't done this year, but it hasn't been great. I'm panicking more about him than I am Breece Hall, just because of the age, because of the contract, because of where the Cowboys cap situation is. Certainly things are not going swell in Dallas at the running back position. That is it for today's show. We want to thank you for making Locked On Dynasty your first listen every single day. We are free and available on all platforms. Check out our show on YouTube. We post shows every single day over there. Everydayers, Matt and Ryan will be back on Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday. Kate, you and I back on Friday to break down this awesome Bengals-Ravens game on Thursday Night Football. We will help you get ready for Week 11. Go follow Kate on Twitter at Kate Maju. Go check out her work at Pro Football Focus. I'm at Marcus_Mosher, and we will see you right back here tomorrow.